My mom called me in the middle of a firefight to tell me she sold my classic car and gave the money to my struggling brother. The insurgents were shooting at our convoy from 3 different positions when my phone started ringing. I was crouched behind a Humvee with rounds pinging off the armor, my squad leader screaming coordinates into his radio, and somehow my mom's ringtone cut through the chaos. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up between bursts of gunfire. She was crying and talking fast, saying she'd sold my 1,967 Camaro to help Marcus with his rent money. The car I'd restored myself over 2 years, spending every weekend in the garage. The one I'd told her was worth at least $30,000. She said the dealer only gave her $8,000, but Marcus needed it desperately, or he'd be homeless by Friday. I tried to process this while bullets were flying around me, shouting that we'd talk when I got back to base. The call lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour while explosions went off in the background. When I returned stateside 3 months later, I went straight to Marcus's apartment expecting to find him struggling to make ends meet. Instead, I found a renovated downtown loft with expensive leather furniture and a brand new Harley-Davidson parked outside. When I asked about the rent crisis that had cost me my car, he seemed genuinely confused and said he'd been doing fine financially for months. I called Mom that night and asked specifically about the $8,000. She got nervous and started stumbling over her words, saying Marcus had used it to pay off debt. But when I pressed for details about what kind of debt, she changed the subject completely and hung up. That's when I started paying attention to things that didn't add up. Marcus had new designer clothes and was posting photos from expensive restaurants and vacation spots on social media. When I asked him about work, he was deliberately vague and said he'd been doing freelance consulting projects. But I couldn't find any evidence he'd worked anywhere legitimate in the past 6 months. I checked with the dealer Mom had mentioned selling the car to. They had no record of buying a 1,967 Camaro from anyone in our family, and the manager said they hadn't dealt with classic cars in over a year. When I confronted Mom about this obvious lie, she broke down and said she'd actually sold it to a private collector, not a dealer. She couldn't remember the collector's name, phone number, or even how she'd contacted them. Something was seriously wrong with this whole situation. I started tracking Mom's bank account through our shared family plan and found regular cash withdrawals of $300 every single week since I deployed overseas. Always on Thursdays, always from the same ATM near Marcus's neighborhood, always at exactly 2 p.m. I also noticed Mom had been making expensive purchases lately that made no sense for someone who claimed to be financially struggling. New kitchen appliances, a vacation to Miami she never mentioned taking, payments to contractors for house repairs I hadn't seen when I visited. Money was flowing somewhere, but clearly not to help Marcus with rent. Last week, I decided to follow Marcus to see what he was really doing with his time. He drove to an office building downtown and met with 3 other men in expensive suits. They handed him a briefcase, and he handed them something back. The whole exchange took less than 2 minutes, but it looked like a professional business transaction. When I checked the building directory later, the office was registered to a debt collection agency called Rapid Recovery Services. That's when I realized Marcus wasn't struggling financially at all. He was blackmailing Mom, and that's when I discovered what he'd been threatening her with for the past 8 months.